Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show. Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss essential topics about the art and culture of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Florence. Andiamo avanti. Welcome back, Renaissance people. It's been quite a busy end of the year here, and I'm excited to have some time to work on more content for this show and to give you guys something to listen to on your drives or flights to go see your loved ones or to, I don't know, sit through an awkward holiday dinner with people you see once a year or, I don't know, while you sit at home happily avoiding any and all of it, whatever the winter solstice time does for you. For those of you who follow the Instagram linked in the show notes here, if not, you have seen I have updated you on my personal research with the Magi chapel in the Medici Palace in Florence. I'm not going to bore you with all the excruciating details of that project, not yet. Given that this resonates with our current cultural practices, namely in nativity displays and the association of the Christmas period with the birth of Jesus Christ, I think it'll be fun to explore the significance of that general theme in Florence during the Renaissance. I call this a holiday special, but the topic conforms to a more Christian tradition, which I will explain in detail. However, I just want to be clear that the Italian Renaissance podcast wishes all of you the most pleasant holiday season, regardless of which you are celebrating or not celebrating. And yet, Renaissance Florence is a Christian world. If there is anything I want absolutely clear, is that the revival of the culture of classical antiquity in the Renaissance has to be in collaboration with the predominant Christian culture of the period. As such, we arrive at unique and interesting renditions of classical themes that penetrate popular religion, such as what we saw in Botticelli's Primavera. Yet, the story of the Magi, or the three wise men as they're referred to popularly here in the U.S., is used both as wholly devotional in Florence and as a tool of defining secular Medici power. Interesting, eh? Keep in mind that the biblical stories and figures tend to not always have universal popularity in Christian Europe. Instead, certain tales and icons develop more of a cult following or a location-specific variety of admiration that align with local practices, festivals, etc. Or in this case, the careful manipulation of such practices in order to establish public trust and power, as the Medici did. So, to demonstrate this, we are going to be looking at how the religious practice manifests, the art that comes around it, and the political consequences. Just a brief side note, history hasn't actually determined the birth date of the real Jesus figure. Rather, historical Christianity, as with all of its holidays, adopted already established pagan holidays and Christianized them. That means that his birth is celebrated on December the 25th, not that he was actually born then. Yet, the sign of the Capricorn becomes a symbol for his birth in later Renaissance art, so keep that in mind. The story of the Magi tells us of the three wise men, or the three kings, as some call them, who were from the east. Keep in mind, just a generic east in the early 1400s, which matters for us, so stay with me here. The journey through Jerusalem, and they follow a star to Bethlehem where the newborn Christ was, in a manger, right? We've heard this. And they bestow gifts upon him. This is the origin of the classical nativity scene that we see all the time. Now, King Herod was threatened, as he knew Christ was to be king, according to the story, and as such wanted the Magi to report back to him with the location of the Christ child, so that he could really do away with him. Yet, being warned of this, the Magi actually returned home without alerting Herod to where his location was. So we get the gist of this, right? Go in front of any church in the U.S. this time of year, and you will see the three wise men paying homage to the infant Christ, likely with Mary and Joseph and some camels or animals like that that really mark their Eastern exoticness, okay? So in Florence during the 15th century, particularly under Cosimo de Medici, Magi processions were a matter of public spectacle that made up a part of the holiday festivities along with nativity plays. Just a side note, because I know the Medici are popular here, I'm talking Cosimo the Elder, not Duke Cosimo de Medici, who comes later. This is Cosimo, son of Giovanni de' Medici, right? Who was the first Medici to bring the family into prominence. Cosimo was the major patron of Donatello, right, like David, and is the grandfather of Lorenzo the Magnificent and Giuliano de' Medici, who we've talked about in good detail with the Pazzi conspiracy, right? Poor Giuliano gets some sharp objects in his body, right? Or Botticelli, Simonetta Vespucci under, Lorenzo and Giuliano. So we're 2 generations before them, when Medici power was fully consolidated under Cosimo, in which the Magi imagery and culture was a tool in this consolidation of power, and we're going to get there. These processions used popular landmarks in the city as stand-ins for the biblical ones. That means that the procession of the Magi starts in Jerusalem, which was in Cosimo's time the baptistry of Florence, in front of the cathedral. Then they processed down the Via Larga, the widest central street in the city, and arrived at last finishing in the monastery of San Marco, which was to represent Bethlehem, where the infant Christ was born. Notably, that procession would pass right by the Palazzo Medici. Right? It's also not far from San Marco Monastery, which benefited greatly from Cosimo's patronage and deliberate generosity. Cosimo even had his own monk cell there, which was painted with an adoration of the Magi scene by Benozzo Gozzoli. And really, to this day, this space is adorned with Medici symbolism. Right? You know today, by just looking around San Marco, that most of its decoration was paid for by the Medici. So, I'm going to read a little blurb from really the best source on Cosimo's patronage, a book by Dale Kent. He says that after 1434, the Medici were indelibly and almost exclusively associated in their native Florence with this popular cult, meaning the cult of the Magi. Are we beginning to see how this religious story is being used both in the layout of the city and in art patronage to be associated with political power? We're not done yet. Let's take a look at the art around this story so that we can bring it all together. Starting with Gentile da Fabriano, his very famous Adoration of the Magi from 1423 is the best example of the visual attitude around this story as it was in the early 1400s. The 3 Magi are shown in their entire journey from the top left, across the top, and ending as presenting themselves to the infant Christ, who is sort of enthroned on Mary's lap, right? So if you're looking at this image, you're going to read it from the top left, and every group of 3 figures with the gold halos represents the Magi. So this one kind of scene shows them in the steps of their journey, ending in the adoration of Christ. So they appear 4 times in total, right? Which shows how the early Quattrocento is holding on to medieval pictorial modes, right? Where narrative can be shown in stages or steps along one picture plane. We see them depicted as convention of the time says. They represent the 3 phases of life: youth, middle age, and old age. That is Caspian, Balthazar, and Melchior. Those are their names, right? Their actual appearance is generic. They and their massive entourage of, cheetahs and crazy-looking people are Eastern representations from Gentile da Fabriano's imagination of what an Easterner may look like, or even how they may be presented in Florentine Magi processions and like the physical costume that people would wear as they were part of these processions down the Via Larga from the baptistry to San Marco, right? A very similar scene, the less dramatic, is done by Lorenzo Monaco, another adoration painting. And there are countless adoration paintings from Florence in the period that resemble this model. What this did was promote an intense curiosity about who the Easterner was and what they looked like, or how they might be associated with the birth of Christ. So one can imagine what a moment it was when actual Easterners processed into Florence under Cosimo de Medici's generous hospitality. Let me explain. In the Byzantium capital of Constantinople, the Ottoman Turks were advancing their armies, right? So the Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaeologus was ruler over the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was aggressively separated from the Latin West, led by the Pope in Rome. The only option to gain support against the Ottoman advance was to appeal to the Pope and other Italian powers. As such, they opted for a council, which was to be held in the city of Ferrara in Italy, but it was unfortunately struck by plague, the city. So, Cosimo took this as an opportunity and paid out of his own pocket for the way of the entire Byzantine cohort to come to Florence, in which they arrived as the very true and real embodiment of the Eastern kings that were so popular in their art. Namely, this was the emperor and the Patriarch of Constantinople. As such, not only did Cosimo provide this for the Florentine public, but he established himself as a central figure in the unification of the East and West churches against the rising Islamic tide, something that had really seemed impossible until that moment. So, artists actually had direct access to actual representations of what they imagined to be the East. And this had an immediate impact on images around the Magi. Ultimately, the unification did fail to prevent the Ottoman invasion, and by 1453, Mehmed the Conqueror sacked Constantinople, ending the long rule of the Byzantine Empire. And if you didn't know, the Byzantine Empire was actually the extension of the Roman Empire. So once the actual city of Rome fell, it moved to Byzantium, where it was renamed Constantinople under Emperor Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor. People don't realize that the last true extension of the Roman Empire didn't fall until 1453. Under Islamic rule, it became the capital of the Ottoman Empire and was renamed Istanbul. You all know the song, I'm sure. And just an aside, the Ottoman Empire lasted until 1922, so this is really as connected to current history as it is to Renaissance history. So those Byzantine scholars, hosted by Cosimo before the fall, right, Remember, the Byzantine entourage comes to Florence for the council, 1430s, early 1440s. They bring with them the entourage of Byzantine nobility and scholars and all the like, right? Constantinople falls, and many found a new home in Florence, recalling the hospitality of Cosimo, where they brought with them their Greek texts and their heightened, really, classical education, which influenced that in Florence, ultimately helping fuel the classical revival that we see in full force by the end of the Quattrocento with Michelangelo and all the rest that we've talked about up until this point. Are we seeing what's happening here? So when we at last arrive to 1459, 6 years after the fall of Constantinople, Cosimo commissions Benozzo Gozzoli, who decorated his palace chapel, with a painting called The Procession of the Magi. Now, Gozzoli also did his Adoration of the Magi in San Marco, but now we're doing a procession. Keep in mind that it is not an adoration scene in itself. In fact, this chapel, instead of a generic Eastern faces that we saw from Gentile and from Lorenzo Monaco, but is instead full of dozens of individualized portraits, including of the Medici themselves, at least Cosimo, Piero, his son, Piero the Gouty, he's later called, and the young Lorenzo and Giuliano. The imagery for this is directly taken from the visual vocabulary developed by the Byzantine entourage coming to Florence. The fresco itself is a commemoration of Cosimo's achievement of hosting the Council of Florence a decade or so prior. Well, a little more than that. It has also been argued extensively, and frankly I do uphold this argument, that the middle Magus Balthazar clearly represents Emperor John VIII Palaeologus, who is surrounded by other representations of the East mixed with portraits of contemporary Florentine courtesans. See what's happening here? Cosimo is using the Magi as a political device to show his own scope of power, merging his contemporaries with his perceived dominion over the East. How? First, let's come back to what I said earlier about the Magi. They represent the 3 stages of life. That is on their own. It is not coincidence that they are shown alongside 3 generations of Medici. And when I say alongside, I mean within the same fresco cycle. They don't stand next to each other, okay? We're not looking at a banking family in this light, but rather a dynasty. This painting shows Medici power as dynastic. It passes on to the next generation and the next, Cosimo, Piero, Lorenzo, upheld by the religious attitudes that are emboldened by their patronage. Wicked. Isn't that wicked? They're using religious currents, merging it with their political objectives, and manipulating the public perception of them by those means. And that's not all. They are uniquely shown in procession journeying through the land towards Bethlehem, right? A representation of the Medici as not just Florentine powers, but among the global scope of elites, particularly in the mercantile world of the Mediterranean. It's all clever calculation, guys. And these frescoes were seen by courtesans, foreign delegates, local powers of the Republic, right? Because it's a republic, wink, wink. Remember, the Medici are not actually titled rulers. They're not even of noble status. They don't come from noble blood. Cosimo carefully crafted an image of power through his wealth that enabled a de facto rule over Florence all the way through Lorenzo the Magnificent. And his did that using our charming little Christmas story about a baby Christ in a manger. Ain't that something? So by the time Botticelli's painting his famous Adoration of the Magi in the 1470s under Medici patronage, we see numerous theories, including from Vasari himself, which indicate the Magi are now actually Medici portraits, not just Eastern portraits of, say, Emperor John VIII, with the Medici among them. The Magi are the Medici, which is consolidating direct association with the Medici family as Magi, those who bestow generosity to Christ, or those who pay for the decoration and maintenance of the most central authority in the Renaissance, the Christian Church. So, let me summarize for you all. The long-standing tradition in Florence of the Adoration of the Magi, a Christmas-time celebration that bred our modern nativity scene, was taken up by Cosimo de Medici to consolidate his power in Florence, both through public spectacle and art patronage. His eventual hosting of the Byzantine entourage enabled a more accurate reading of Eastern figures by the Florentine Republic and their artists, changing how Magi are depicted in art, bringing them to the immediate reality of Florence, as opposed to a fascination of Florentine imagination. To further establish their visual image as global elites, but ones who were ingrained in helping the church, the Magi in Florentine art become inseparable from associations with Medici power, and they usurped its role as a religious festivity in favor of a secular association with Medici dynastic influence and mercantile Mediterranean excellence. Did you get that? Is that all clear now? And just one last aside, as we are contextualizing the Medici and the Magi in terms of the kind of global Mediterranean as it was in the Quattrocento, is that as well as being representations as the three stages of life, the Magi often also represent the three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. So not only are the Medici trying to liken themselves to the Magi in terms of a global mercantile power, they are asserting themselves in terms of Christian dominion in relation to Christ across the entirety of the Mediterranean. Additionally, and importantly on that note, is that very often, and in none of the examples that I've given you for particular reasons, but very often the representation of Africa is a black man. So if you are doing racial studies and art history, this is a lead for you. It is a lead that I don't have the skills yet to follow, but I'm working on. Why one of the three Magi is not black in Florentine Magi paintings versus elsewhere, I don't know. If you know, let me know. Because I'll also say, as far as Benozzo Gozzoli's Procession of the Magi fresco, there are black people evident, and one has even been potentially identified as a popular slave figure that was a person owned by the Cardinal of Portugal. So there's weird race stuff happening in this sort of representation because, of course, the Mediterranean is not a white space entirely. In fact, only a smaller part of it is. So it's definitely something that's a little troubling and difficult to sort out all the moving parts of race dynamics in the Mediterranean in the Quattrocento. As always, I will be posting the images that we've talked about to the Instagram and to the Facebook. So please be sure to follow, be sure to like, and be sure to share. And Any and all support is appreciated. Leave us a nice review. Tell your friends. Help this content get out. Help this community grow. Stay tuned for more episodes coming out ahead of Season 2, which I plan to focus on the Renaissance as it occurred in La Serenissima. It's a riddle for you if you don't know what that is. I'm wishing you all the happiest of holidays, a wonderful new year. Until next time, arrivederci.